The rain started around 8 p.m., a steady patter against the tall windows of the Rookery, my dimly lit corner of the city. The bar wasn't much, a narrow room with worn leather stools and shelves of bottles reflecting the muted glow of amber light. But it had a kind of charm. I called it home 5 nights a week, serving cocktails to regulars who didn't want to talk and strangers who sometimes talked too much. That night I was wiping down the bar when they walked in, a man and a woman. Not together, but close enough that I noticed. The man went straight to a booth near the back, barely glancing at the room. He was tall and lean, dressed in a nondescript gray coat that seemed just a touch too big for him. The woman arrived a few moments later, pausing at the door as if debating whether to come inside. She was younger than the man, with sharp features softened by a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She finally stepped in, her heels clicking against the worn wood floor as she headed for the same booth. I didn't think much of it at first. People met in my bar all the time. Friends, lovers, business partners, sometimes even enemies. But there was something about the way they sat, her back to the door, him leaning in close, that made me pause. As I wiped a glass, I noticed they weren't drinking. The man had ordered a black coffee, the woman nothing at all. She kept glancing around the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Their conversation was hushed, their voices barely audible beneath the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. I don't usually eavesdrop. It's bad form, and besides, most conversations aren't worth the trouble. But something about their low, urgent whispers caught my attention. "The clock is ticking," the man murmured, his voice clipped and precise. The woman shifted in her seat, her eyes darting toward me. I busied myself with stacking cocktail napkins, but I caught the words. "Do you think they know?" "They will, soon enough," the man replied. "But if everything's in place, it won't matter." A chill crept over me, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the rain outside, or the way the shadows in the bar seemed darker than usual, pooling in the corners like something alive. I kept listening, pretending to rearrange the bottles on the back shelf. "It's risky," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "What if—" The man cut her off sharply. "There's no what if. It happens tomorrow. No delays. Tomorrow." My pulse quickened, though I didn't understand why. Something about the way he said it, calm, certain, made my stomach twist. A burst of laughter from the other end of the bar startled me. One of the regulars, Pete, was telling a joke to his buddy Tom. They were oblivious to the tension in the room, to the way the air seemed heavier around that back booth. The man leaned closer to the woman, his voice dropping so low I could barely hear him. "We'll meet at the secondary location. Make sure the decoy is in place." "Decoy?" The word sent a shiver down my spine. They spoke a little longer, their words too muffled to make out. When the man stood to leave, he slipped a matchbook across the table to the woman. She hesitated before picking it up, her hand shaking slightly. I pretended not to notice as he walked past me, his steps deliberate and measured. The woman stayed behind, staring at the matchbook as if it held the answer to some terrible question. The woman left about 10 minutes later, leaving her chair slightly askew and her untouched glass of water on the table. I waited until the bar cleared out, a little after midnight, before heading to the booth. My fingers brushed over the tabletop, searching for clues to whatever had transpired there. The matchbook was still there, black with a single word embossed in gold on the cover. Solace. I flipped it open. Inside was an address written in neat, precise handwriting. 225 West Langdon Street. I'd lived in the city long enough to know that address was in the warehouse district. The kind of place you avoided at night, where the only lights came from flickering street lamps and the occasional glow of a cigarette. I should have let it go. tossed the matchbook in the trash and forgotten about the whole thing. But the words decoy and clock is ticking gnawed at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was unfolding, something I wasn't supposed to know about. The rain had let up by the time I closed the bar. I locked the doors, the key cold and solid in my hand, and stood on the empty sidewalk, staring at the matchbook. The address pulled at me, like a string tied around my ribs, tugging me toward a decision I wasn't ready to make. I hailed a cab before I could think too much. 225 West Langdon, I told the driver. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. That's not a great area. Just take me there, I said, clutching the matchbook tightly. The streets blurred past, dark and wet from the rain. My heart pounded in time with the rhythm of the windshield wipers. I told myself I'd just take a look, see if anything seemed out of place, and leave. The cab dropped me off a block away from the address. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark and its brick wall stained with graffiti. A single light burned above a rusted metal door, flickering like a dying flame. I crept closer, my footsteps muffled by the wet pavement. The matchbook was still in my hand, the word solace gleaming faintly in the dim light. Something moved inside the warehouse, just a shadow, quick and fleeting, but enough to make my breath catch. I hesitated at the edge of the light, torn between curiosity and fear. Then the door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The warehouse smelled of rust and damp wood, the air thick with the musty tang of mildew. A faint hum echoed from somewhere above, like distant machinery barely ticking over. I stood just inside the door, frozen, my ears straining for any sign of movement. The door had creaked open on its own, or so I told myself, but now it was shut, a solid barrier between me and the cold night outside. The matchbook felt heavy in my hand. I flipped it open, staring at the address scrawled inside, as though it might change into an explanation or an apology. The faint sound of footsteps jolted me out of my thoughts. They were soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the shadows. My heart thudded painfully as I edged forward, one careful step at a time, my sneakers scuffing against the concrete floor. The space opened up into a wide, cavernous room. Pale moonlight filtered through a cracked skylight, casting weak, silvery beams across rows of crates and towering shelves. In the center of the room stood a single table, cluttered with papers and what looked like a small cassette recorder. I wasn't alone. A figure stood with their back to me, hunched slightly as they rummaged through the papers. They wore a long coat, the hem brushing the floor, and their hands moved quickly, shuffling and sorting with an urgency that set my teeth on edge. I should have turned and left. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, to slip back into the night before I was noticed. But something held me in place. Curiosity, fear, or the faintest glimmer of hope that I could unravel this mystery before it unraveled me. The figure stiffened, their hands stilling mid-motion. "You shouldn't be here," they said without turning around. Their voice was low, the kind of tone that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "I didn't mean to," I started, but the words died in my throat as they turned to face me. The man from the bar, the gray coat, the sharp features, the same piercing gaze that pinned me where I stood. His eyes narrowed as he took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "You've been following me." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the matchbook was still clutched in my hand, a damning piece of evidence. His gaze flicked to it, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was curious," I said, my voice unsteady. "I heard you talking at the bar, and you should have stayed out of it." He interrupted, his tone flat but heavy with warning. "Curiosity is dangerous." Before I could respond, a soft beeping sound cut through the silence. He glanced at the table, then back at me, his expression tightening. "You need to leave," he said, stepping past me toward the door. "Right now." The sense of dread that had been building all night surged to the forefront. "What's going on? What's this about?" He hesitated, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, I thought he might answer. Then he shook his head. "You don't want to know." The door creaked open, and he was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, my thoughts racing. Something was happening, something bigger than I'd imagined, and I was caught in the middle of it. I turned back to the table, my curiosity overriding my better judgment. The papers were a tangle of maps, schedules, and cryptic notes written in the same precise handwriting as the matchbook. My eyes locked onto a page circled in red ink. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m., final checkpoint." A faint noise behind me, like the scrape of metal on concrete, made me whirl around. The room was empty, but the shadows seemed darker, heavier, as if they were pressing closer. I shoved the papers into my bag and left without looking back. By the time I got back to my apartment, the streets were eerily quiet. My own footsteps echoed too loudly, and the dim glow of the streetlights felt more like an interrogation than a comfort. I locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place. The weight of the night settled over me as I dumped the papers onto the kitchen table, spreading them out under the harsh glare of the overhead light. The words and diagrams blurred together, a maze of information that made my head ache. There were names, most unfamiliar, though one stood out: Solace Initiative. I traced the letters with my finger, a sense of unease prickling at the back of my neck. I was in over my head. The phone rang, startling me. I let it ring twice before answering. "I told you to leave," a voice said, a voice I recognized immediately. "How did you get this number?" There was a pause. "That's the least of your worries. You've stepped into something you don't understand, and it's too late to step back." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the receiver, my pulse pounding in my ears. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a faint flicker of motion near the window. I turned, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just my own reflection in the glass, pale and drawn under the harsh light. But as I looked closer, my stomach twisted. The reflection wasn't quite right. My movements were mirrored, but there was a lag, a fraction of a second too slow, like a video buffering on a bad connection. I stepped closer to the window, reaching out to touch the glass. My reflection did the same, but the delay was more pronounced now, the figure's hand hesitating before meeting mine. Then it smiled. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection's expression returned to normal, as if daring me to question what I'd just seen. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, pooling at the edges of the light. I backed away, the matchbook slipping from my hand to the floor. Outside, a car engine rumbled, idling for a moment before fading into the night. I wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, the world outside felt different. The city was the same as ever, cars rumbling down wet streets, pedestrians huddled in their coats. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every reflective surface seemed alive, every shadow a little too deep. The matchbook sat on my counter where I dropped it, its glossy black surface catching the weak light filtering through my kitchen blinds. Solace. The word had taken on a sinister weight, its meaning warped in my mind. Whatever it was, I was part of it now. I didn't know why I went back to the Rookery that night. The bar felt safer somehow, its dim lighting and familiar smells offering a thin barrier against the unknown. Maybe I thought the routine would help me reclaim some sense of control. I should have known better. The shift started quietly, the way it always did. Regulars filed in, their conversations blending into a low hum. The sound of glasses clinking and ice rattling in shakers was soothing in its predictability. Until the man from the night before walked in. He didn't look at me as he crossed the room, his long coat brushing against the floor. Instead, he took a seat at the same booth, his posture tense, as though bracing for something. I hesitated before walking over. My voice, when I spoke, sounded steadier than I felt. "Back again?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the mirror behind the bar. "You're still in this," he said finally, his voice low. "I warned you to stay out." "I didn't ask to be in anything," I shot back. "You brought this to me." He met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw something crack in his composure. Fear. "It's bigger than you think," he said. "Bigger than both of us." "What is it? What's solace?" Before he could answer, the lights flickered. Just once, but long enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. The hum of conversation faltered, replaced by the soft shuffle of patrons glancing nervously at one another. The man stiffened. "They're here." "Who?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. A chill swept through the bar, as though a window had been left open on a winter's night. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, their glow dimming ever so slightly. I turned toward the mirror behind the bar and froze. The reflections weren't right. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But as I looked closer, the faces in the mirror didn't match the room. People who weren't there, strangers with hollow eyes and distorted features, stared back at me. Their mouths moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. The man grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Don't look at them too long," he hissed. "That's how they get in." I wrenched my gaze away, my heart pounding. The other patrons seemed oblivious, their conversations resuming as if nothing had happened. Only the man and I were aware of the shift, the way the air had thickened, the faint hum that had crept into the edges of hearing. "What do they want?" I whispered. "To pull you in," he said, "to make you part of the story." I didn't understand, but there wasn't time to ask. The shadows in the bar were lengthening, creeping toward us with an unnatural fluidity. The figures in the mirror moved faster now, their mouths stretching into jagged, soundless screams. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a matchbook identical to the one I had. He placed it on the table between us, his hand trembling slightly. "This is your way out," he said. "You can walk away, but once you light it, you'll have to let it burn all the way down. No second chances." I stared at the matchbook, the weight of his words pressing down on me. The shadows coiled around the edges of the booth, darker and hungrier than before. "What happens if I don't?" He looked at me, his expression grave. "Then they finish the story without you." The air felt suffocating, the noise in the mirror growing louder, though still inaudible. My hands shook as I picked up the matchbook, the smooth surface cool against my fingers. "Light it," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. I struck the match, the tiny flame flaring to life. It danced in the dim light, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The hum in the room grew louder, the reflections in the mirror writhing as if in agony. The flame burned down the stick, the heat biting at my fingertips. I held on until the fire reached the very end, then dropped it onto the table. The matchbook erupted in a brilliant burst of light, a flash so bright it left me blinking spots from my vision. When the light faded, the room was silent. The man was gone. The shadows had retreated, the reflections in the mirror once again matching the patrons in the bar. Everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. The matchbook on the table was blank now, the word solace burned away. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me.